All right, hello, and welcome to our podcast on Christian allusions in literature. I have to say that I've borrowed a lot of this information from a great chapter from a great book. And that chapter is called Yes, She's a Christ Figure Too, and it comes from an amazing book called How to Read Literature Like a Professor by Thomas C. Foster. So if you get a chance and you are interested in this topic or this type of thinking about literature, please definitely pick up his book. He does have a newer one out called How to Read a Novel Like a Professor. And so a couple great ways to look at the behind-the-scenes things that we as literature professionals do. And so if you go back to our podcast on allusions in general, I think you'll remember that we said that there were three commonly alluded to texts in Western literature. And by Western literature, we mean the Western Hemisphere. So that could be Western Europe, North America, places like that. If you were to be reading literature from, say, China, or the East, or African literature, something like that, you might see allusions made to different essential texts, because the Bible isn't as big in India as, say, the Bhagavad Gita, or some other religious texts dealing with Hinduism or Buddhism. But since we are here in the West, we're going to talk about the three most commonly alluded to texts in the West. And so those tend to be Greek mythology, and specifically the Odyssey, works by Shakespeare, and of course, the Bible. And so as we kind of move deeper into this, we have to think for a second of why do we even look for allusions? And so oftentimes allusions are a way for the author to try and connect with the reader and say, hey, we've had a shared experience. You remember that? Wink, wink, nod, nod. Another reason allusions are made is that oftentimes they are shortcuts to difficult concepts or descriptions. So, if the author wanted to describe someone as exceptionally evil, he or she could spend pages and pages describing that, describing acts that he or she did, all the crimes that he or she had committed, things like that. Or, the author could simply compare that character to Cain. And this goes back to the Bible, where Cain was the one who committed the first murder by killing his brother Abel. So it's a shortcut. We could show how bad this person is, or we could quickly allude to this relatively commonly known story of Cain and Abel. As always, why does any of this stuff matter in a literature class? And we are reading for a couple purposes, hopefully. One, for entertainment. Hopefully we're hearing a good story, seeing things that we haven't seen before, getting exposure to different trials and tribulations that characters have to face. But also, since we are in a literature class, we are looking for theme. We are looking not just for entertainment, but we are looking for what the author has to say about life, about lessons for life and for all humanity. And that's what we call theme. And so when we are looking for allusions, and oftentimes specifically Christian allusions, we can see that these help reveal the theme or the lesson we're supposed to walk away with after reading this text. And so if we are reading the Bible as literature rather than some sort of holy inspired book, we look at the people in that book as characters. And so think about the stories behind some of the big name characters in the Bible: Moses, Abraham, Mary, Judas. Those are going to be big names. And probably the biggest name of all is going to be Jesus himself. And so we're not looking at this as some sort of revealed word. That is theology class. We are reading it as a piece of literature that has conflict, that has plot, characters, resolution, things like that. And so if we see some of these people, we are seeing them as characters. And therefore the stories that come out of these characters or are related to them are not so much in terms of divining holiness, but as in telling a plot or conflict. As always, when we are reading, we say this a lot in class, sometimes a tree is just a tree. And what we mean is not every tree has to be symbolic of something. If you are reading and you feel like the author is moving for a deeper purpose, is trying to connect something to something deeper, maybe at that interpretive level, then sure, put the pieces together and form your own opinion. Is the tree in this case a tree or something else? In addition, when somebody is, say, eating a meal, does that necessarily mean it's the Last Supper? Just because someone takes a bath, does that necessarily mean it is baptism? So as we're going, as always, be critical thinkers. What do you see? What do the clues of the text give you? What does your background knowledge give you? See if you can put all of those things together and see if you can form a reasonable interpretation, or perhaps that tree is just a tree. So one thing that might help you as you go into this podcast a little bit further is to think about what background knowledge you already have about Christianity. And I completely understand. Some people are not Christian in their faith. Some people have no background knowledge in terms of Christianity and religion, and that is totally okay. Try and think what types of things have pervaded popular culture, or things that just have pervaded our society. So we don't need to know the ins and outs of Romans 15 or John 4 or whatever those may be, but think about big things, such as, say, Noah and the ark, the Garden of Eden and the temptation of the fruit, or how snakes tend to be bad, things like that. So take a minute, stop the podcast, and see if you can bring up some of that background knowledge you have of either specific Christian stories, the Bible itself, or maybe just some of the major stories and events that have pervaded culture. As we are thinking about Christian allusions in literature, we have to take away one thing that Foster said in his book, that it's probably a pretty safe bet that many of the writers of the so-called classics that we may be reading in this relatively traditional literature class were probably raised before the middle of the 20th century. And so education and schooling and the connection with religious schooling is probably a little bit different then than it is now. Now we are hypersensitive to keeping school, church, and state separate, but at the time that many of the writers of these classics that we may be reading, it was a little bit more blended. It was definitely a more religious society overall. Church attendance was higher. People definitely identified themselves as more religious back in the day than they do now. Therefore, if some of these writers, such as Steinbeck, Harper Lee, Dalton Trumbo, or others, they are most likely well-versed in religion. Therefore, some of their thoughts of religion may pervade or come into their pieces that they are writing. So just because somebody may have gone to church doesn't mean that they're going to write an overtly religious text. But many of these classics were written in a much more religious time. And so that is a challenge for us, because sometimes we're not as well-versed in certain things as the authors themselves may have been. And so as we're going through some of these cues of potential Christian allusions, we have to ask ourselves, is the author hinting at a character being like Christ, or is he or she supposed to actually be Christ as a figure? And so you can have characters that have mixes of these. You can have multiple characters in a book who share resemblances to Christ or the devil or to whatever. Most likely, one character isn't going to have every single thing on this list, because then they wouldn't be like Christ. They would be Christ, and then you'd be reading the Bible or something. And so as you look at this list, be very careful to look at it and say, where do characters have some of these things, but not others? And then we have to ask ourselves that deeper question, if a character has some, but not all, what is the author saying through that character, or why would they do this? And that gets us toward our examination of theme, which is always a good thing. One more piece of warning before we get into that list, we have to think about author intent. We can't necessarily read any sort of piece of literature and say, oh my goodness, there's a character with his arms out. The narrator said he had his arms out, therefore he has to be Christ. We have to kind of think about what the author might have meant and consider that piece of evidence of arms out in the whole scope of the book. You can't just look at page 15 and go, oh, they're eating dinner. Clearly, that character is supposed to be Christ, and clearly, tomorrow's going to be a bad day for him. You can't necessarily say that. But if that character does have a challenging day after that Last Supper, and then does have some sort of ceremonial or symbolic rebirth a couple days later, and you've put those things together, then you might be looking at a Christ-like character, and all of that might be adding to theme. So we can't just say aliens because I think it's aliens. We have to consider what the authors might have meant by planting these clues. Or if they're not even clues at all, and that tree is just a tree.